They burned women for knowing how to stop a fever. Long before pharmaceutical companies or medical schools, there existed a global underground network of botanical wisdom guarded by Egyptian priests, tested by Greek warriors, refined by medieval monks, perfected by indigenous healers, and punished when practiced by women accused of witchcraft. Some were bitter enough to make warriors weep. Others were traded for armor or whispered to grant immortality. The wildest part? Many still grow today in forests, between sidewalk cracks, even as weeds in your backyard. Today at Stellar Eureka, we're retracing the origin of that ancient knowledge, from temple gardens to battlefield kits, from monastery herbs to outlawed remedies. These are 20 superfoods, survival plants, and medicinal powerhouses that kept entire civilizations alive and still grow all around us today. The tomb of Tutankhamun held golden chariots, precious jewels, and enough treasure to fund a small kingdom. But among all that glittering wealth, archaeologists found something that revealed the true priorities of ancient Egyptian royalty: dried chamomile flowers, carefully preserved for the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Egyptian embalmers believed that death was just another form of sleep, and chamomile was their master key to peaceful rest in both worlds. But chamomile wasn't the only flower earning divine status in Egyptian medicine cabinets. In the sweltering heat of ancient Nubia, where the blue and white Nile converged and Egyptian pharaohs built monuments to their eternal power, palace physicians had discovered another floral miracle: hibiscus, served in cups the color of rubies. This wasn't ceremonial tea, it was prescribed medicine, carefully administered to pharaohs whose blood ran too hot from the stress of governing empires and maintaining divine status in mortal bodies. Court physicians had observed a deadly pattern. Rulers who regularly consumed the tart cranberry-like tea remained vigorous and clear-minded well into old age, while those who refused it often suffered from mysterious ailments, flushed faces, pounding headaches, and sudden collapses that ended dynasties without warning. The pharaohs had unknowingly developed one of history's first cardiac prevention protocols. But the Egyptians' greatest botanical discovery wasn't reserved for pharaohs alone. Every palace courtyard grew spiky plants that seemed almost alien in their architecture. Thick, succulent leaves filled with clear gel that could heal burns faster than any other treatment available. Aloe Vera, the plant of immortality, democratized healing in ways that royal medicine never could. The burn should have killed her. Nefertiti's royal cosmetic assistant had accidentally knocked over a bronze brazier while preparing the queen's evening oils, sending molten metal cascading across her forearm. In most ancient civilizations, such an injury meant certain death from infection, if the victim survived the initial trauma at all. Within minutes, the girl's arm was packed with thick, clear gel squeezed from those spiky palace plants. The gel felt impossibly cool against her burning flesh, immediately drawing out heat and pain that should have been unbearable. 7 days later, new skin was already forming. Within a month, barely a scar remained. This was Egypt's gift to human civilization: the understanding that some plants were so fundamentally useful to survival that they transcended class, wealth, and social status. The same chamomile that prepared pharaohs for eternity could calm any anxious mind. The hibiscus that protected royal hearts grew wild throughout the region. The aloe that healed palace burns worked equally well on common laborers. Egyptian healing wisdom didn't remain locked in desert kingdoms. As trade routes connected the ancient world, botanical knowledge traveled north across the Mediterranean, where Greek warriors were about to revolutionize battlefield medicine through sheer, desperate necessity. The arrow had found its mark. Paris's shot, guided, according to Homer, by the god Apollo himself, had pierced the only vulnerable spot on the greatest warrior who ever lived. Achilles lay dying on the blood-soaked plains of Troy, his legendary invincibility finally broken by a simple projectile to his heel. But Homer's Iliad reveals something that most readers miss. Achilles didn't die immediately from his wound. He lived long enough to treat it with a plant that had sustained Greek warriors throughout the 10-year siege, a feathery-leafed herb that soldiers called herbal militaris, and we know as yarrow. Every Greek warrior carried dried yarrow in his kit, not as superstition, but as battlefield medicine proven through generations of warfare. The plant's ability to stop bleeding was so reliable that soldiers would pack fresh yarrow leaves directly into sword cuts, watching hemorrhages halt within minutes that would otherwise have meant death from blood loss. Greek military medicine represented a fundamental shift from Egyptian practices, where Egyptian physicians served palace elites with exotic preparations. Greek warriors developed democratic medicine, healing knowledge that every soldier could carry, understand, and apply under the worst possible conditions. This democratic approach extended beyond the battlefield. In Athens, where philosophers gathered to debate the nature of reality, and students competed in intellectual contests that could determine their entire futures, another plant tradition was taking root. Students preparing for examinations would literally crown themselves with fresh rosemary sprigs, believing the herb's piney fragrance could enhance memory and mental clarity. The tradition wasn't superstition, it was primitive neuroscience. What those ancient scholars couldn't have known, but somehow understood through centuries of observation, was that rosemary contains compounds that actually cross the blood-brain barrier and affect neurotransmitter activity. The aromatic oils that made their study crowns smell like Mediterranean hillsides were delivering measurable cognitive benefits straight to their brains. Greek medicine had discovered something revolutionary. Plants could enhance human potential, not just treat human suffering. The yarrow that kept warriors alive also represented a new way of thinking about botanical medicine, not as royal privilege, but as essential technology for anyone facing life's challenges. The Romans inherited Greek medical knowledge but transformed it through their genius for organization and engineering. What Greeks had developed for individual warriors and scholars, Romans systematized for entire armies and civilizations. They called him the Mad Emperor, but Nero might have been the sanest Roman of all. While his contemporaries were poisoning political rivals with exotic toxins and dining on elaborate feasts that regularly killed guests through sheer excess, Nero had developed an obsession with something far more practical: peppermint. He consumed it before every meal, chewed it during long Senate sessions, and even had slaves scatter fresh leaves throughout his palace. His courtiers mocked this peculiar habit, whispering that the emperor had lost his mind over a simple herb. They were wrong about the madness and missing the point entirely. Nero had discovered what Egyptian physicians had known for centuries. Peppermint doesn't just freshen breath, it's nature's reset button for the human digestive system. When Roman banquets featured courses of peacock tongues, dormice stuffed with nuts, and wine mixed with lead-sweetened honey, digestive catastrophe wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. But Nero's innovation paled beside what Roman military engineers accomplished with lavender. When Roman legions marched through Gaul, conquered Celtic warriors reported something that unsettled them more than disciplined formations or superior weapons. These invaders smelled like flowers. The Romans had discovered something revolutionary: an army that stayed clean stayed healthy, and an army that stayed healthy conquered the world. Every Roman soldier carried dried lavender flowers that served multiple tactical purposes. The plant's antiseptic properties meant soldiers could treat wounds and prevent infections. The insect-repelling qualities protected camps from disease-carrying pests. Most importantly, its calming effects helped maintain military discipline during long campaigns. Roman military engineers incorporated lavender into their famous bathhouse designs, creating the first systematic military hygiene program in Western history. The flower that made Roman armies smell like gardens became one of the secret weapons that built an empire. While Roman legions conquered through superior organization and Greek warriors innovated battlefield medicine, far to the east, another healing tradition was developing around a plant so sacred that unauthorized harvesting meant immediate execution. In the sacred groves surrounding Hindu temples across ancient India, where incense smoke carried prayers to the heavens and priests performed rituals that connected earthly suffering to divine healing, basil wasn't just another herb in temple gardens. It was the earthly manifestation of Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and prosperity, and touching it without proper spiritual preparation was considered direct assault on the divine order. But the priest who guarded basil with such lethal devotion understood something that transcended religious symbolism. This aromatic plant possessed healing powers so profound that they seemed supernatural to anyone who didn't understand the science behind them. Temple physicians had discovered that basil could treat conditions that baffled other healers. Respiratory infections that killed children throughout monsoon seasons cleared up after drinking basil tea. Skin conditions that had persisted for years healed when treated with basil paste. Even the mental fog and depression that plagued communities during harsh seasons lifted when people consumed preparations made from these sacred leaves. The plant that had been guarded with such deadly seriousness in temple gardens proved its divinity through sheer, undeniable effectiveness, sacred because it worked, not the reverse. As Roman trade routes connected Britain to Africa, India to Spain, these healing plants, from Egyptian aloe to Greek yarrow to Indian basil, spread throughout the known world, carrying with them the accumulated wisdom of multiple great civilizations. The foundation was laid for what would become medieval Europe's sophisticated understanding of plant medicine, knowledge that would soon be tested by the greatest medical challenges in human history. As the Roman Empire crumbled and barbarian tribes swept across Europe, the accumulated healing wisdom of ancient civilizations faced extinction. Trade routes that had carried Egyptian aloe and Indian spices to Roman markets were severed. Libraries that preserved Greek medical texts burned in barbarian raids. The sophisticated botanical knowledge that had sustained three great empires seemed destined to vanish in the chaos of the Dark Ages. Instead, it found sanctuary in the most unlikely places. Christian monasteries, where monks who had sworn to renounce worldly pleasures were secretly cultivating some of the most sophisticated pharmacies in human history. Brother Thomas clutched his stomach as the abbey bells rang for midnight prayers. Again, for the third night this week, the sharp cramping had returned, a consequence of the strict fasting schedule that left monks eating hardly one day and surviving on bread and water the next. But Brother Thomas knew something the younger monks didn't. Slipping through the moonlit cloister, he made his way to the herb garden, where a particular plant grew in neat, fragrant rows. Not the dramatic sage with its silvery theatrics, but something far more humble, marjoram, with leaves so ordinary they could be mistaken for weeds. 5 minutes later, sipping a tea that tasted like liquid sunshine mixed with flowers, Thomas felt his stomach unknot. The cramping subsided. His racing mind, anxious about tomorrow's Latin examinations and the prior's stern lectures, began to quiet. This scene played out in monasteries across medieval Europe because religious communities had discovered something remarkable. Certain plants didn't just heal the body, they healed the spirit. Marjoram became the secret weapon of monastic life, providing gentle relief for the digestive troubles and anxiety that came with religious discipline. But marjoram was just the beginning. In monastery gardens protected by high walls and religious authority, monks were conducting the first systematic botanical research in medieval Europe. They had salvaged Roman texts, preserved Egyptian papyri, and protected Greek manuscripts that described hundreds of healing plants. Now they had the time, space, and motivation to test whether ancient wisdom could address medieval problems. Nearby, in the monastery gardens, another plant was earning its reputation through sheer, undeniable effectiveness. Sage, revered by ancient Greeks as a symbol of wisdom, found new purpose in medieval monastery infirmaries. When winter coughs threatened to become deadly lung infections, healers would brew strong sage tea or have patients gargle with sage-infused vinegar. The plant's powerful antiseptic properties could stop a sore throat from becoming something far more serious, in an age when respiratory infections regularly killed. The year was 1348. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. In monasteries across the continent, as monks fell ill and died in horrifying numbers, surviving brothers made a desperate decision. They opened their medical libraries to anyone who could read. Desperate times demanded desperate measures, and the carefully guarded secrets of monastic medicine suddenly became public knowledge. Among the most copied recipes was something called monk's gold, a simple salve made from bright orange flower petals that seemed to heal wounds faster than anything else in their arsenal. Those petals belonged to Calendula, and they represented centuries of quiet experimentation in monastery infirmaries. While outside physicians were still debating whether disease came from bad air or divine punishment, monks had been systematically testing which plants actually worked on human flesh. They discovered that calendula petals, when crushed fresh or dried and mixed with oil, could prevent the wound infections that killed more medieval patients than the original injuries. The flower earned its reputation through devastating necessity. Burns healed faster, cuts closed cleaner. Even the festering sores that appeared on plague victims showed improvement when treated with calendula preparations. But calendula's story becomes truly remarkable when you consider its economics. Monasteries began cultivating vast fields of these cheerful orange blooms, not for decoration, but as cash crops. A single monastery garden could produce enough calendula to supply healing salves for an entire region. The flowers bloomed repeatedly throughout the growing season, yielding harvest after harvest of golden petals that translated directly into survival for medieval communities. The monks had accidentally created one of history's first sustainable pharmaceutical industries. The recipe was worth killing for. In medieval Europe, when a single vial of imported spices could buy a horse and preservation meant the difference between surviving winter or starving, alchemists guarded their food preservation formulas more carefully than gold. But the most effective preservative of all wasn't exotic or expensive. It was growing wild on Mediterranean hillsides, free for anyone smart enough to recognize its power. Thyme. Viking raiders returning from southern expeditions carried bundles of this humble herb in their longships, not as seasoning, but as survival technology. They had discovered that meat packed with thyme could survive weeks-long ocean voyages without spoiling, while provisions without it rotted within days. The secret lay in what medieval herbalists called the fire within the leaf, a compound so powerful it could stop bacterial decay in its tracks. Modern chemistry calls it thymol, but medieval preservation masters simply knew it worked better than anything else available. Monastery kitchens became the epicenters of thyme-based preservation science. Brother cooks developed elaborate systems for harvesting thyme at peak potency just before the tiny white flowers opened, when the leaves contained maximum concentrations of their preservative compounds. When the Black Death arrived, thyme's antiseptic properties took on life or death importance. Physicians carried bundles of burning thyme through plague wards, believing its smoke could purify infected air. They weren't wrong. The antimicrobial compounds released during burning thyme actually did reduce airborne bacteria. While monasteries preserved ancient wisdom and developed new treatments, medieval political leaders were discovering that ruling empires required more than military might. It demanded mental and physical health that could withstand incredible stress. The crown was heavy, the empire vast, and Charles the Great, Charlemagne, was losing his mind. By 810, the emperor who had united most of Western Europe under Christian rule was struggling with what his court physicians delicately called melancholia of the humors, a term that would now be understood as a mix of clinical depression and anxiety disorders. Court physicians tried everything in their medieval arsenal: bloodletting, purgatives, prayers, even consultations with Arab scholars. Nothing worked. Then a Benedictine abbot arrived at Aachen carrying a simple gift: dried leaves of an herb his monks called honey leaf, for its sweet scent and the way it attracted bees to their gardens. Lemon balm. Within weeks of drinking daily tea made from these aromatic leaves, Charlemagne's transformation astonished his court. The emperor, who had been brooding and irritable, began sleeping through the night. His mental clarity returned. He resumed the intensive schedule of governance that had built his empire. So impressed was Charlemagne by this humble herb's power that he issued one of history's first royal plant mandates. Lemon balm must be cultivated in every monastery garden throughout his realm. The herb that calmed an emperor's mind became the foundation for medieval Europe's understanding that certain plants could heal not just bodies, but the very thoughts that governed them. Sir Geoffrey de Montfort was 3,000 miles from home, bleeding from a Saracen sword wound, and watching his fellow crusaders die not from battle injuries, but from something far worse, the complete collapse of morale. It was 1191, deep into the Third Crusade, and the Christian army besieging Acre had discovered that conquering the Holy Land required more than religious fervor and heavy armor. Months of brutal fighting, dysentery, and homesickness had broken men's spirit as thoroughly as any military defeat. Then a Templar knight who served in earlier campaigns shared knowledge that would echo through military history. A blue, star-shaped flower that grew wild throughout the Mediterranean, which local healers called the courage plant, borage. Within days, crusader foraging parties were competing to gather the brilliant blue flowers that seemed to shine like tiny stars against the harsh Levantine landscape. They brewed it into tea, despite its cucumber-like taste that reminded homesick knights of English gardens they might never see again. The transformation was documented in multiple crusader chronicles. Men who had been listless and despairing suddenly found their fighting spirit restored. The plant that Arabs called the father of sweat for its ability to break fevers also seemed to break the psychological fevers that had been destroying Christian morale. Modern chemistry explains what medieval warriors observed. Borage contains compounds that genuinely affect mood and stress response, along with beneficial oils that reduce inflammation and support nervous system function. The Crusaders had discovered botanical psychiatry without understanding the mechanisms. But the botanical knowledge that sustained Crusader armies in distant lands would soon be tested by an enemy far deadlier than any Saracen blade. 2 centuries after Christian knights returned from the Holy Land carrying seeds and stories of healing plants, Europe faced a catastrophe that would make battlefield medicine seem quaint by comparison. When the Black Death arrived in 1348, it brought with it a new kind of warrior, one whose weapon wasn't a sword, but the desperate hope that plants could hold back death itself. The figure was unmistakable and terrifying. A black-robed plague doctor stalking through 14th century London streets, his grotesque bird-like mask designed to filter poisoned air through aromatic herbs stuffed into the beak. But the most chilling part wasn't the mask, it was the constant rhythmic sucking noise as he consumed small, bitter lozenges that kept his throat clear and his breathing steady while tending to patients whom other physicians had abandoned as hopeless. Those lozenges were made from horehound. While the Black Death claimed 1/3 of Europe's population, plague doctors developed their own desperate survival protocols. They discovered that this white-flowered, woolly-leafed herb, bitter as wormwood and tough as leather, could keep their respiratory systems functional even when surrounded by the deadly miasma they believed carried the plague. Plague physicians weren't the first to unlock horehound's secrets. Roman soldiers had chewed dried horehound leaves during forced marches, using its expectorant properties to clear dust and debris from their lungs. But it was during the plague years that horehound transformed from monastery medicine into mass-produced survival candy. Enterprising apothecaries began boiling horehound leaves with honey and molding the mixture into portable lozenges that could be carried and consumed throughout the day. The business model was grimly effective. As long as plague raged, demand for horehound candy remained unlimited. Medieval Europe had survived its greatest test. The plants that sustained monasteries through political chaos, armies through foreign campaigns, and entire populations through pandemic disease had proven their worth through the most brutal trials in human history. But as medieval society began to recover and expand, new challenges would emerge, and with them, the need for new medicines from distant lands. The survivors of medieval Europe's plagues and famines looked outward with renewed ambition. As the Renaissance dawned and maritime technology advanced, European explorers began venturing beyond familiar Mediterranean trade routes into vast oceans that promised either fortune or death. What they didn't expect was to discover that indigenous peoples across the world had developed their own sophisticated plant medicines, knowledge that would revolutionize European healing traditions and enable conquest that stretched across continents. The Spanish conquistadors were dying, not from Aztec warriors or jungle diseases, but from something far more insidious. Their teeth were falling out, their wounds wouldn't heal, and a mysterious weakness was claiming more soldiers than any battle. Scurvy, though they didn't know to call it that, was destroying Cortez's army from within. What the conquistadors couldn't understand was that their bodies were literally dissolving from the inside out. Months at sea surviving on hardtack, salt pork, and wine had stripped their systems of a vital nutrient that kept human tissue intact. Without it, the very bonds that held their bodies together, the collagen in their skin, the strength in their bones, the integrity of their blood vessels, began to fail catastrophically. Then an Aztec healer, probably amused by these armored invaders who conquered empires but couldn't figure out basic nutrition, pointed to a climbing plant with round leaves and bright orange flowers growing wild around their camp. The nasturtium. What happened next changed the course of colonial history. Spanish soldiers began eating the peppery leaves and flowers, initially grimacing at the sharp, mustard-like bite that earned the plant its name, literally nose twister in Latin. Within weeks, their bleeding gums healed, their energy returned, the mysterious wasting disease that had been decimating their ranks simply disappeared. Those conquistadors had stumbled onto one of nature's most concentrated sources of vitamin C, higher even than oranges, packed into leaves and flowers that grew like weeds throughout the Americas. The plant that indigenous peoples had been eating casually for centuries became the Spanish Empire's secret weapon against nutritional collapse. Seeds traveled back to Europe in conquistadors' pockets, where nasturtiums escaped Spanish gardens to naturalize across the continent. The flower that had saved Spanish armies became Europe's introduction to New World medicine. But the Spanish weren't the first European explorers to face nutritional catastrophe in distant waters. Centuries earlier, when Viking longships pushed beyond the edges of the known world, other seafaring warriors had confronted the same invisible enemy that would later devastate conquistadors. The difference was that some Vikings had learned to fight back, not with swords or axes, but with exotic roots that cost more than their weight in silver. The ship was dying, and so was everyone aboard it. Captain Eric Magnuson's longship had been trapped in North Atlantic ice for 3 weeks, somewhere between Norway and the mysterious lands his scouts called Vinland. The crew that had terrorized English monasteries and conquered half of Europe was being defeated by something invisible, a creeping weakness that made strong warriors collapse. Then Astrid the Wise, the only woman aboard and keeper of the crew's medical supplies, made a decision that would save them all. From a carefully guarded leather pouch, she produced what looked like twisted, pale roots, treasures she had acquired during a raid on Constantinople, where Byzantine merchants had paid fortunes for these exotic imports from distant spice lands. Ginger. She ordered the ship's cook to brew these roots into a fiery tea that burned throats and brought tears to Vikings' eyes accustomed to mead and ale. The warriors grumbled, cursed, and drank it anyway, because when Astrid the Wise gave medical orders, even berserkers obeyed. Within days, the mysterious weakness began lifting. Bleeding gums stopped bleeding. Energy returned to men who had been barely able to row. What Astrid understood through hard-won experience, modern medicine confirms through research. Ginger contains compounds that prevent and treat scurvy while providing warming properties that helped crews survive Arctic conditions. The root that had cost Byzantine gold became Viking survival technology, enabling the maritime expansion that would take Norse explorers to North America centuries before Columbus, powered by medicine that grew in tropical Asian gardens thousands of miles from frozen northern seas. But not all explorers were sailing to distant lands in search of new worlds. Some were exploring inner frontiers, the hidden mysteries of matter itself, seeking to transform base metals into gold and discover the elixir of eternal life. These alchemical pioneers faced their own kind of peril, not from storms or starvation, but from the very substances they believed would unlock nature's greatest secrets. The alchemist was going to die from his own experiments. Paracelsus, the brilliant, arrogant physician who had revolutionized 16th century medicine by insisting that the dose makes the poison, was discovering the truth of his own words in the most personal way possible. Years of experimenting with mercury, lead, and other toxic compounds in his quest to create the Philosopher's Stone had finally caught up with him. His liver was failing. The yellowing skin, the swelling abdomen, the mental fog, all signs that his body's primary detoxification organ was shutting down under the accumulated burden of metallic poisons. Traditional physicians offered nothing but prayers and bloodletting, but Paracelsus had spent his career studying the healing wisdom of common folk, the very people his university-trained colleagues dismissed as ignorant. In his desperate final months, he turned to knowledge gleaned from German peasant healers who had been treating liver ailments for generations with a spiky purple thistle that grew in disturbed ground. Milk thistle. The plant's distinctive white-veined leaves had given it a reputation in folk medicine as a liver remedy, the white markings resembling the pale complexion of liver patients, which medieval physicians interpreted as nature's signature, indicating the plant's medicinal purpose. Within weeks of consuming daily preparations made from milk thistle seeds, Paracelsus began experiencing something that defied medical understanding. His liver function was improving. The yellowing faded, the swelling reduced, his mental clarity returned. Paracelsus lived long enough to document his recovery and add milk thistle to the growing pharmacopoeia of plant medicines that were revolutionizing European healthcare. The thistle that had saved the father of toxicology became proof of his greatest insight. In nature's pharmacy, every poison has an antidote waiting to be discovered by those wise enough to look beyond academic prejudice. As European exploration brought new knowledge from distant continents, the stage was set for another dark chapter in botanical history, one where the very knowledge that could heal minds and bodies would be twisted into evidence of supernatural evil. The Renaissance brought not only exploration and discovery, but also unprecedented paranoia about supernatural forces. As Europe battled over religion, political instability, and recurring plagues, authorities increasingly turned to scapegoating. The same plant knowledge that had sustained communities through medieval hardships suddenly became evidence of diabolic conspiracy. Wise women who had preserved healing traditions for generations found themselves accused of witchcraft, their botanical expertise twisted into proof of supernatural malevolence. They burned witches for less. In 1592, when the Würzburg witch trials were at their peak, and Prince Bishop Julius Ector was sending hundreds of suspected witches to the stake, a peculiar plant was saving lives in ways that defied medieval understanding of medicine and madness. The condemned were easy to spot: hollow-eyed villagers who barely spoke, who had stopped working their fields, who sat motionless for hours staring at nothing. What we now recognize as severe depression was then interpreted as demonic possession, the devil's own darkness invading human souls. But in the shadows of persecution, village-wise women continued their dangerous work with a yellow-flowered plant that bloomed precisely on St. John's Day, June 24th. They called it St. John's wort, and it performed what only can be described as miracles. Within weeks of consuming tea made from its flowers and leaves, the possessed began speaking again. They returned to their fields, smiled at their children, resumed normal life. The darkness that had consumed them simply lifted. To Inquisition authorities, this was proof of witchcraft. Any woman caught gathering St. John's wort during its peak flowering time risked torture and execution. The plant itself was declared suspect, its uncanny ability to restore human spirits marking it as potentially diabolic. The persecution created an underground network of herbal knowledge. Mothers passed secrets to daughters in whispered conversations. Recipes were memorized rather than written down. Gathering expeditions happened under cover of darkness during new moons when Inquisition spies were less likely to be watching. Those who risked everything to preserve this knowledge weren't practicing magic. They were practicing medicine centuries ahead of its time, understanding through careful observation that human mental suffering could be treated with plants rather than prayers, exorcisms, or executions. The trial was a sham, but the evidence was damning. Agnes Waterhouse stood before the judge in Chelmsford, England, accused of consorting with the devil through her familiar, a cat named Satan, who allegedly helped her practice maleficent magic. The year was 1566, and England's first recorded witch trial was about to make legal history for all the wrong reasons. But the most damning evidence against Agnes wasn't her supposed conversations with Satan the cat. It was the garden behind her cottage, where investigators had found rows of a particular herb that sent every cat in the village into fits of ecstatic rolling, purring, and behavior that seemed decidedly supernatural to 16th century minds. Catnip. To witch hunters, the connection was obvious. Any woman who could make cats behave in such otherworldly ways must be practicing dark magic. What Agnes actually understood, but couldn't explain without further incriminating herself, was that catnip served double duty as both cat entertainment and human medicine. While her tabby Satan rolled in blissful abandon among the plants, Agnes was quietly cultivating one of the most effective natural remedies for human anxiety and insomnia available in Tudor England. The compound responsible for feline euphoria acted as a mild sedative in human nervous systems, providing gentle relief for the stress and sleeplessness that plagued communities living under constant threat of starvation, disease, and witch trials. While Agnes was executed for allegedly using catnip to practice evil magic, she had actually been using it to provide compassionate medical care to neighbors who couldn't afford professional physicians. The plant that supposedly proved her guilt had been healing the very community that condemned her. Her execution made catnip even more suspect in the eyes of authorities, driving underground the knowledge that this humble herb could treat human ailments with remarkable effectiveness. The witch's cat herb became forbidden medicine, its healing properties suppressed by fear of supernatural associations. Even as European persecution reached its peak, across the Atlantic Ocean, indigenous peoples continued developing sophisticated plant medicines based on thousands of years of careful observation, knowledge that would soon prove essential to European colonial survival. While European authorities burned wise women for their botanical knowledge, across the Atlantic Ocean, Native American tribes were perfecting healing traditions that stretched back millennia. These weren't primitive folk remedies, but sophisticated medical systems based on intimate understanding of local ecosystems. When European colonists finally encountered these practices, they discovered that indigenous peoples had developed solutions to health problems that European medicine couldn't touch, botanical knowledge that would prove essential to colonial survival in the New World. The Lakota called it isnadi, and when they saw its purple petals dancing in the wind across endless grasslands, they knew winter survival was within reach. While European physicians were still bleeding patients with leeches and prescribing mercury for everything from headaches to heartbreak, Plains Indian tribes had already spent centuries perfecting something far more effective, a flowering plant that could rebuild human immune systems from the ground up. The warrior's breath came in ragged clouds as he stumbled into camp, buffalo blood still dark under his fingernails. 3 days trekking across frozen grasslands had left Running Wolf's arms torn by thorns, his shoulders weighted with exhaustion, and that familiar scratch in his throat warned of the sickness that could kill more warriors than enemy arrows. No trading post for hundreds of miles. No white doctor with his mercury and bloodletting. Only the tribal medicine woman who carried her healing secrets in worn leather pouches, knowledge passed down through generations like sacred fire. She would send him to find the purple coneflower, Echinacea, growing wild in prairie meadows. Not just any part of the plant, but specifically the roots, dug carefully and chewed fresh or brewed into a bitter tea that tasted like earth and survival. Here's what those medicine women understood that modern science is still catching up to. Echinacea doesn't just treat symptoms, it teaches your immune system to fight more effectively. The plant contains complex sugars and compounds that actually stimulate white blood cell production and activity. When European settlers first encountered this practice, they dismissed it as savage superstition. Then they started getting sick, really sick. The diseases that barely affected native populations who had been using Echinacea for generations devastated European communities with no plant medicine knowledge. By the 1800s, Echinacea had become one of the most widely used medicines in America. The primitive plant medicine had conquered the advanced medical establishment simply by working better than anything else available. But the Lakota weren't the only tribe whose healing wisdom would challenge European assumptions about medicine and the mind. Far to the southeast, in the mist-shrouded mountains of the Cherokee homeland, another ancient plant tradition was addressing a problem that European physicians barely understood: the mental discipline that defined Cherokee medicine. The medicine man's apprentice was failing his final test. For 3 days, young Running Bear had sat motionless in the sacred grove, attempting the vision quest that would complete his training as a healer for his Cherokee band. But instead of the spiritual clarity his elders expected, his mind raced with doubt, fear, and the kind of restless energy that made meditation impossible. His teacher, Grey Wolf, watched him from the shadows with growing concern. Without the ability to achieve the deep mental stillness that guided Cherokee healing practices, Running Bear would never master the plant medicines that kept their people healthy through harsh mountain winters. On the fourth dawn, Grey Wolf approached his struggling apprentice with a simple blue flower that grew in the moist woodlands surrounding their village. The flower's shape resembled a tiny cap or helmet, which Cherokee healers called the hat that quiets storms, what botanists would later classify as skullcap. Within an hour of brewing and drinking tea made from these unassuming flowers, Running Bear felt his mental turbulence begin to settle. The anxiety that had been sabotaging his vision quest dissolved into calm awareness. By sunset, he had achieved the profound meditative state that marked successful completion of his healing training. Cherokee medicine women had discovered through generations of careful observation that skullcap possessed remarkable properties for treating what they called mind sickness, the anxiety, depression, and nervous disorders that could disable warriors and healers alike. The herb became essential to Cherokee healing practices, not just for treating individual patients, but for maintaining the mental clarity that healers needed to practice their demanding profession. As European colonization intensified and Native American knowledge began filtering into colonial settlements, a new kind of botanical crisis was emerging. The same European newcomers who had initially dismissed indigenous plant wisdom as savage superstition were about to discover that their survival in the New World depended on understanding relationships between plants, animals, and ecosystems that native peoples had observed for centuries. The colony was dying, and Dr. John Bartram knew it. Standing in his Pennsylvania garden in 1738, America's first great botanist watched his honeybee hives with growing alarm. The insects that had been thriving since he'd imported them from Europe were now sluggish, diseased, and abandoning their carefully constructed homes. Without healthy bees, his experimental gardens, where he was testing which old-world crops could survive in American soil, would fail completely. Colonial agriculture depended on these imported pollinators, and their mysterious decline threatened food security across the growing settlements. Then, a visiting Mohawk elder, observing Bartram's distress, pointed to a red-flowered plant growing wild at the forest edge. Through broken English and gestures, he explained that his people called it the bee's medicine and used it to treat both human ailments and the mysterious sicknesses that sometimes affected wild bee populations. Bee balm. Skeptical but desperate, Bartram began planting bee balm around his failing hives. Within weeks, the bees weren't just visiting these flowers, they were preferentially seeking them out, spending unusually long periods feeding on their nectar and seeming to recover their vitality in the process. What Bartram had stumbled onto was sophisticated ecological medicine. Bee balm contains natural antimicrobial compounds that bees instinctively seek out when fighting infections. The Mohawk had observed this relationship for generations, understanding that certain plants served as medicine for both humans and the pollinators essential to their food systems. The plant that had saved Dr. Bartram's bees became America's introduction to the concept that human medicine and ecological health were inseparably connected, a lesson indigenous peoples had been teaching for centuries to anyone wise enough to listen. As European colonization intensified and Native American knowledge began merging with Old World traditions, a different kind of botanical wisdom emerged. One born not from formal medical training or religious authority, but from the desperate resourcefulness of common people struggling to survive in an unforgiving world. Marie Claire was going to die, and she knew it. The year was 1709, and the Great Frost had locked France in ice for months. Noble families in their chateaux might survive on stored grain and preserved meats, but peasant families like Marie Claire's had watched their food supplies dwindle to nothing. Then her grandmother, barely alive herself at 83, grabbed Marie Claire's arm with surprising strength and whispered something that would save them all. The yellow teeth. Find the yellow teeth. What followed was a desperate education in survival botany. Grandmother led Marie Claire through frozen fields to patches of ground where snow had melted, revealing the distinctive jagged leaves that gave dandelions their name, dent de lion, tooth of the lion in French. They gathered every leaf, every root they could find. Grandmother showed Marie Claire how to prepare them, young leaves eaten fresh despite their bitter bite, older leaves boiled to remove some of the harshness, roots roasted and ground into a coffee-like drink that provides calories when calories didn't exist anywhere else. Within a week, the family's energy began returning. The children stopped crying from hunger. Marie Claire realized her grandmother had passed down something more valuable than gold, the knowledge that survival food was growing everywhere, disguised as weeds. Dandelions weren't just famine food, they were medicine. Every part of the plant served a purpose that French peasants had discovered through generations of necessity. The leaves cleansed blood and supported liver function after months of poor nutrition. The roots acted as natural diuretics, helping bodies process the minimal calories they received. The aristocrats who looked down on peasant families never understood that these ignorant rural folk possessed botanical knowledge that could sustain human life when all other systems failed. Meanwhile, within the safer walls of the French palace, the fool was the only one free to speak the truth. In a world where a single misstep meant exile or death, only the jester could mock power without consequence. But the jester's wisdom came with a price, the crushing responsibility of walking a tightrope between entertainment and treason. One misjudged joke, one moment of going too far, and the fool would find himself in the dungeon, or worse. Which is why experienced jesters always kept a secret. a small supply of flowers that looked like tiny faces, each marked with patterns that resembled human expressions. The French called them pensées, thoughts, because their distinctive markings suggested deep contemplation. Pansies. Medieval court physicians knew these flowers eased the mental strain of dangerous roles. A jester might brew pansy tea for clarity of thought, while quietly using it to cope with the pressure of mocking absolute power. The flowers weren't just medicine, they were camouflage. Their anti-inflammatory properties helped treat the physical ailments that plagued court entertainers: sore throat from constant talking, skin irritations from elaborate costumes, and the digestive problems that came from eating rich court food after growing up on peasant fare. The flower that looked like a thoughtful face became the perfect medicine for those whose survival depended on thinking faster and more clearly than everyone around them, including the monarchs who held their lives in their hands. From the sacred smoke of Greek temples to the desperate gardens of plague-ridden monasteries, from Viking longships in Arctic ice to Cherokee healing groves in Appalachian forest, we've uncovered the hidden pharmacy that sustained our ancestors through centuries of disease and famine. These weren't just folk cures, they were sophisticated medicines, tested over generations by healers who knew that survival often depended on the plants growing in forgotten corners of the world. The scholars who wore rosemary crowns weren't casting spells, they were sharpening cognition. The monks who grew calendula weren't tending flowers, they were cultivating antibiotics. The women who risked death for St. John's wort weren't summoning demons, they were treating depression before it had a name. The most astonishing part? These plants still work. The yarrow that healed Achilles still grows wild. The sage of the oracles still scents old monasteries. The dandelions that saved starving peasants still crack city sidewalks. This isn't about rejecting modern medicine. It's about reclaiming lost knowledge. The same plants that helped us survive the Black Death, Viking winters, and colonial scurvy are still here, if you know what to look for. So which of these forgotten healers will you welcome back into your life? Are there any you're already using, or powerful ones we missed? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the hidden wisdom of the natural world. This is Stellar Eureka, signing off.